So, Jack, your thoughts about Brand's modest challenge, and Carl, good, join us, about the 200-year, 250-year time perspective. Carl, your thoughts?
Let's have a conversation.
I think. Am I on?
I don't think these mics are on.
No, I think they are now. They are now.
All right.
My projects and studies with colleagues over the last 30 or 40 years have always aimed at the grandchild. And 250 seems too long. 5 years is too short. Grandchild is exactly right for most of the communities I deal with. I also find myself awkwardly incompetent at the global scale, but really good at the regional scale, which is where I think the big decisions are implemented. Because I actually am cynical about uniformity of policy at the global level, and I'd rather have diversity of policy embedded in the global level. I remember in a section in the book that I just wrote on geodesign. I was an MIT student in 60 to 66.
When were you there?
70.
Yeah.
And
So you were close.
very close, yeah. And Kevin Lynch wrote a paper that I consider one of the 2 or 3 great papers in history called Environmental Adaptability. And he was arguing for a long view and for non-specialization of structures. In other words, if you build a hotel, it might end up being a hospital, it might end up being housing in its generation. And the amortization of structures and utility systems was in this 40, 50, 30, 60-year period. And so you can't predict far beyond that 30-year, 20-year, 40-year period and feel comfortable that you're really making sense.
I couldn't agree more, but I guess I'm proposing something somewhat different,
Yeah.
which is to say, I believe there will always be the imperative for near-term and mid-term projects. What you're talking about are mid-term projects.
Well,
what I'm saying is,
in this room, that would be long.
couldn't agree more.
I agree with you. It's
But what I'm saying is, I believe there needs to be a global framework that those plug into,
Yeah, I
that
agree.
basically say, okay, the consequences of building 20 of these 30 to 60-year maturing power grids is the following.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that there are some overlays, for example, the fragility of critical infrastructures, which we will pay a very dear price for getting wrong, that the natural processes that make those time-constant projects happen won't tolerate the cost of.
Yeah.
And that at a certain point, if you look at, well, what is the function of government, it really ought to be to look after us on the level that can't be solved by business or by local decisions, et cetera. So I guess what I'm saying is, I couldn't agree more that those planning cycles are essential, but I believe there has to be something longer that those plunk into.
Yeah, I'm so anxious to ask. By the way, that was a great
Yeah.
presentation.
Yeah,
I mean, really, don't you think?
Yeah.
It's just unbelievable to me. I'm anxious to pick up a conversation that happened in this room a few months ago.
Oh, yeah.
The 3 of us were involved in it, about this notion of superorganisms, because you sort of indirectly referred to them, large corporations that are multinational, that increasingly are taking on the role of controlling aspects of the planet and the economy, and sort of a growing globalization through the political world and military world. These are forces that are even more controlling than our natural forces of weather. It seems to me, at least, we're aware of it. In your conversation, you're sort of suggesting something like another superorganism, an organism. I'm actually asking, so I'll make up what I got from it, an organism that is made up of data, measurements, of apps, of knowledge, of models about how the world works, that we dip into. It doesn't control us, but we dip into that knowledge, we share our knowledge, and through transactions called short-term designs or long-term design, regional designs or long-term designs, we're dipping into that, like the web is the only thing I can think of like it. You dip into that knowledge base and you can bring out, or I can share what I did as a footprint and you can look at it. You called it last night history. And I can pull it out and I can use it, or I can use somebody else's best practices. And in other words, it's a kind of, what I'm thinking I'm getting from you is a kind of superorganism of knowledge. And tell me what you think about that.
I think there are always different lenses of how you look at this.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at a given organization, and on one level, there's the social architecture, who's in it, how do they interact with each other, how do they interact with others. You look at it from a different perspective, there's the operational architecture, what's their business, what do they do, how do they do it. You make sausage, you turn the crank, something comes out, how do you do that? And then there's the technical architecture, which is the IT, the process, the other stuff that supports doing the buildings, the physical spaces, the kind of
platform.
Exactly. And it's all the same organism, but if you look at it different ways. Now, the problem is when we talk innovation, everybody wants to start with the technical architecture, which I would argue is actually the last thing one needs to look at in this. You have to start with the social behaviors because those are the hardest things to change, et cetera. You don't get the behavior in society, civilization, or a company that you ask for. You get the behavior you reward. It's pretty simple. So you can come up with some grand set of rules, but if you say, I want you to innovate, and just don't screw up my project, you're going to get a very different, kind of behavior. How many organizations do you do that give an award for the most imaginative failure of the year? You screwed this up in a way that none of us could anticipate.
MIT does, in fact.
It's just literally the best minds couldn't imagine the damage you did in this period of time. So we'd like to give you this in gratitude for that.
You're talking to me here.
Exactly. That's right. But what I'm suggesting is a little bit more Darwinian and, for lack of a better word, algorithmic, which is to say that you get that effect of the superorganism without having a superorganism.
Without creating it.
Exactly, which is why what I'm saying is, when I'm talking about at a global level, if there are a set of fairly basic things you agree to, what was the inspiration for the internet? If you look at what is the greatest invention of our age, it would be pretty hard not to look at the internet as being something that coalesced a whole bunch of things. Okay, arguably, but if you believe that, the people who invented it, most of which are still alive, kind of interesting, basically thought that interoperability was what was fundamentally important. And the way to achieve that is the opposite of the way we design cities. So we design cities top down. Here are all the rules. Here's the green space, the corridors, the transportation, all of that. What the founders of the internet said is, we're only going to legislate the very lowest level stuff necessary to achieve interoperability. And then you can build whatever you want on top of that. But if you get it right down here, device that hasn't been invented yet, 10 years from now, will work with device that was put in place 30 years ago. And the internet as a machine has never broken. Kind of interesting to note this machine was built that's self-healing and self-correcting, because the problem is people think of things like routers as being machines. They're not. A router is an idea. A switch is an idea. These things are an idea in the topology of the network. I would argue the most powerful ideas are those. That's what the Bill of Rights is. And so when I talk about, a Bill of Rights for our planet, it's basically saying, I'm not going to pass a set of global, rules and stuff that at a level of excessive granularity, attempts to regulate and predict the future and plan where it is. But I am going to say there are a set of underlying first principles, the first principles of geodesigning, that basically say if you get these wrong, the society isn't going to interact anything. So that's what I'm saying. So you get your superorganism. You will also get unpredictable emergent behaviors, which you get in big systems, and you may have to, kind of look back and say, oh, that wasn't such a hot idea. We didn't realize what's happening, because you end up accidentally rewarding a behavior and an outcome that you didn't anticipate, so that happens. But I think if you get the algorithm right, if you get these first principles right, if you get this notion of low-level interoperability being where you should focus the global level, then it allows for your differentiation, regionalization, the ability at the level of execution, but it also means the power grid might not all collapse when it goes together. It also means you probably won't run out of water because even though you didn't solve this problem here, we got a way to solve it over there.
You know, Brand, one of the things that came to my mind during your talk was that GIS is, in a way, spatial compression through layering, but you were actually talking about geodesign as temporal compression, that we are compressing, you know, in theory, 250 years of thinking through this tool.
I would argue that this multi-layer of a two-dimensional view of the world. Now, you can argue it, you know, details, but you know what I'm talking about. It's basically saying the layers of all of that, all of which are either at some snapshot in time, where you choose to look at it at that moment, whether they're real-time feeds or not, isn't good enough. And that what geodesign does is basically go into what I call a geotemporal domain. There might be a better word for it, but that basically says it's the time constant of how this stuff is all moving forward together and how it works. And that's when I believe it gives you the ability to do this type of storytelling of saying, let me show you your future.
Carl, go
Let me
ahead.
pick up on the storytelling idea. I found that to be very, very important in the talk you gave 4 years ago, and again this time. It was presented as we're supposed to tell the story. My experience is a little bit different. My experience is that the reason that we're involved in a place is because there are more than one story. There are more than one story, and they're very articulate, and they're being told to us. Next month, I have to run a workshop for 4 universities in Japan on Soma City, which is in the Fukushima 50 zone. And there are 2 stories. One is the people want to rebuild, and the other is they shouldn't. All right? Now, these are 2 stories that are there. They're very articulate, they're very powerful, they're very ingrained. It's a zero-sum game, we think, but may not be a zero-sum game. The 2 stories are not communicating with each other. In other words, story A doesn't know the consequences of story B, and story B doesn't know the consequences of story A, or they have imaginary views of it. But getting these 2 together, working on each other's solutions, maybe the level of understanding says it's not a zero-sum game. Maybe there's a new thing that comes out. Maybe one loses, maybe one wins. I don't know the outcomes. But by taking the stories that are being given to you and saying what are the consequences in a collaborative, off-campus, you may be able to solve a problem that right now is unsolvable. And I think that the circumstances that geodesign is best at is not where there's a site, a client, a program, but where there's no site, no client, no program, but multiple views of a future that have to be reconciled somehow.
And you play the role of being a therapist.
You're in the middle of this.
You play like a therapist.
You're the outsider that is. You are the therapist. You are. You're the outsider. You're the outsider who is not the advocate for one position or the other, but trying to figure out how these people can talk to each other. And because at the scale that these decisions are being made, which is not the individual in his house, but a more public scale, it is a public consensus. You're absolutely right. Between the idea and the bureaucracy, if they don't come together, nothing happens. If nothing happens, they all lose, and it's exactly the circumstance.
Which is what we're seeing unfold before us daily.
Absolutely, absolutely. But that role is a very, very different role that most of us are being taught by and practicing in, and that role is, I think, the prime one. I think it's sine qua non in terms of the importance toward making a better world. Otherwise, it goes to hell. Very simple.
I'm really curious about how you facilitate a conversation about 100 years from now.
Well,
Because, I mean, if everything's transactional, it's quarterly driven or election period driven or whatever it is, it's the pulse that we're living as. How do you open up
a very
a longer
astute
conversation?
observation in an architecture class I once experienced was where a student asked the great man, expounding before them, your projects are so complex and involved, et cetera, how do you start? And the answer is, you begin. And I think that's the key, is you decide, you being a number of people who actually share the belief that having this view is important, you go spend a day and you talk about it and you start building a framework and you share that with others. And ultimately, it's the ahas. It's the thing where you read something that someone said, and that was interesting when you first talked to me about geodesign. I said, geodesign? What's geodesign? Etc. And then I read a little bit about it, and then it became interesting to me in these dimensions of it being a storytelling medium, which I hadn't read anything about. So that for me was an aha. I read enough, and because I come at it from a different view than the professionals who actually know something about it, now, is that useful to the dialogue or not? You never know, but you begin. And you start with this notion of getting people together with the express purpose of let's explore this idea space and see what emerges.
I keep thinking about my little town. What's Redlands going to be like in 100 years from now? I mean, we should have that conversation, maybe in this room. I'm using that as an example because maybe you should, members in the audience, start a conversation in your town or your city or your whatever it is. Can you imagine getting your community together and starting a little conversation about what should we create, and not what will it be like?
Well,
there's that dimension of it.
Well,
There's what will it be like, but also what could we create?
But to your,
which is exactly
but to your
the
point of the
dimension.
superorganism, if others are doing the 250-year plan for the power grid, which basically says in order to have a viable thing, we will have these geothermal, these nuclear, these water, these other things, and all of that. And if you're going to do that, you, when you're developing your 100-year plan for Redlands, might want to consider how much solar collection area you need. And by the way, it can provide shading for other things that you might decide are useful to have shading for, because it gets hotter in the summer, et cetera. And so that's the power of it, is that you don't have to think through the problems that are difficult to think through locally. Thinking through a global power grid is difficult. Thinking about how transportation nodes work is difficult because it requires a set of skills you generally don't have at a local level. And so that's where this idea of nested conversations that are networked together, I believe, takes on its power, because you get to benefit from the insights of others. And incidentally, from the benefits of the people working on the 6-year plans or the 5-year or the 30-year plans. I would argue, up until this point, we haven't had a framework to put that all together and allow it to be layered or examined in time or invited in other things. And that's what geodesign at its highest, achievable goal
That's what you
can
talked
do.
about last night. Do you want to open it up?
Yeah, anyone else want to jump in? We could also,
Raise your
hand. Here you
say
go.
your name.
Yeah.
Somebody will bring a mic.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question.
Bring a mic, please. Isn't there
Or just talk loud.
Well, yeah,
talk
I'll
loud.
talk loud, and I'll repeat. I'll repeat.
I wanted to ask
Introduce yourself and then,
okay.
yeah.
My name is Frank Magny. I'm in the IT field. So I look at this and I look at periods of change and so forth, and I'm 50 years old. I've seen a lot of change in my lifetime. So I actually used to live in Redlands, and I look at Redlands now and I see the changes that have gone on since I've been gone. And my question is, for people that are really enthusiastic and excited about all the changes they can create, how do you keep them from being discouraged against the powers that would say, stay within the framework?
Did you all hear the question? How do you keep people from getting discouraged over long time frames from achieving these kinds of...
And I say this to address the younger people who are skilled in these areas and who are excited about it, and to not let them be beat down by the fact that there are people in power that don't want to change.
I don't think change is good per se. And I don't think creativity is good per se. It's not the objective to be creative or I didn't mean the word good. It's not the objective to be creative, it's the objective to be good. And this statement that Bran mentioned, I've also used it. Laurie Olin said about landscape architecture as a profession. A good landscape architect is like a good barber. There are 3 rules. The first rule is protect what you have. The second rule is edit carefully. And the third is invent when necessary. And I actually think that's a good principle. It's a Buddhist principle. It's the middle ground. Don't believe for a minute that anybody can be famous for 15 minutes, but not for 250 years. It doesn't happen the same way. So I really think some diminution of the premium placed on being different. I think our society wants people to be different because the public media eat that. But that's not necessarily good. And I think that if you look at a place carefully and its society carefully, that editing carefully is a better objective than inventing. You have to invent sometimes, especially when models fail or when models predict a future that's unacceptable. Then you have to go beyond information given. But you have to realize that that's the circumstance before you do. Your first sketch for the world is likely to be as likely as not to be dangerous than good. And you really have to think about that carefully.
I would also add that how do you protect them? That's your job.
Yeah.
So you made it to 50. Your job is to protect the teenagers and the 6-year-olds and 20-year-olds and to give them encouragement and say that. I mean, one of the problems a lot of people have is what to focus on. And so they do 45 different things and they don't make much progress on any one of them. So some of the advice you might give is say, you know, pick one thing you think you can be really good at and just focus on that and come up with a solution and don't be discouraged. Sometimes just a word, just saying to someone, don't be discouraged, you know, point out the examples to them. You look at the great inventions that changed the course of civilization, whether it's electric light, whether it's the cell phone, the thing is, there was never consensus for any of these. The inventors often died penniless. I wouldn't bring that up. But, you know.
Or young, yeah.
Exactly. But the reality is, the right word, the right nod, the night, you know, it's okay, keep with it. What you're doing is really good. And the fact that nobody realizes that, they will, you know, that's your job.
Yeah, one of my best friends is Kent Smith. I think I introduced you to him.
I know.
You know him?
I know.
One time he came to my office, he says, you know, it isn't the big decisions that you make once every month or year or whatever. It's the 10 or 15 little transactional decisions that you make every day. And that actually makes the difference of the thing working. Which sort of leads me to another thought that I had when you were speaking, Brian. There's the whole planet. If we envisioned that we had a living atlas in the web or in the network, and actually the bad designs as well as the good designs were simply transactions on the database of the digital planet. That's what I thought you were getting at in terms of we link all transactions of change, human directed or maybe even modeled from natural world, to this transactional database of change. The world suddenly becomes modelable digitally.
Exactly.
And
You're getting better or worse as you
and
move
then
step by
this
step.
It gives you
database-
something to evaluate each decision. Now,
yeah, and this
Agreed.
database we can dig into to do models about
and
10
more
year,
often
50
than
year.
not, it's not going to be a black and white answer because few things in life are. But that's your job as a design professional to interpret those results and be able to do something. But right now, you don't have that tool and that option available. You may in a very small area, but you don't at the
In the big
global.
one.
And it's
That's
that
right.
network effect that basically says, by us agreeing in the World Wide Web to the interface standards, by us agreeing to cloud computing architectures, by us agreeing to a bunch of these things.
Layers.
These layers, which also means that I can, on my smartphone, tie into that while I'm standing looking at the thing that I'm considering, which can give me that aha, because at that moment I could pull together the work product of 1 million people and actually see cause and effect, or develop my design instincts because now all of a sudden I can see the implications of my actions, which are often not obvious.
I mean, one of the big things for me in design school was be critical. So driving down the road, I'm critical at every building, every layout, everything, you know. I think you taught me that. Be a critic, be critical. And nothing was really that good. You're just always looking at the critical side. That realized in a digital environment where you're being able to understand critically relationships,
It's a fascinating balance
consequences of
between, on one level, being critical and at the same time being wildly enthusiastic. I mean, you basically need
Yes.
both because you have to wake up in the morning. And I think we're reaching a stage in the evolution of our country, for example, that Americans are not feeling so great about their country. You know, is it because we're going to be the number 3 economic power in 25 years? You know, who knows? It's a bunch of things like that. But part of what design can do is generate optimism. You can actually generate a sense that there is a bright future ahead. I mean, I remember, what we're hearing
just
about
stop
the
you
economy
before-
of China is what we heard about Japan.
Before you go there about optimism, by the way, Brand designed this room. Isn't it an amazing space?
Yeah,
And the
yeah.
whole space out here. So it's about being optimistic and having that feeling. But go back to China, sorry.
Well, we're talking about how China is going to own the world in 20 minutes and, we're all, et cetera. We heard that about Japan 15, 20 years ago. And the notion was, you can't change this. Look at the curves, look at the data, look at that, we'll own it. It's going to be $1 million per square inch for land in Tokyo and the whole thing and all of that. And the only thing wrong with that argument that was very well reasoned, thoughtful, the best economists of our time, is it was completely wrong. And it went poof. Now, why is China going to go poof? Well, having only one child per family and no girls means there's nobody to take care of the old people. And having a whole, you think we've got a healthcare problem? Wait to see in 20 years where China's going to be, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the kind of thing which generates instability. And that sort of instability is terrifying, to anyone running anything. Yeah. Instability is not your idea of a good time. China is exactly the same. So I think the issue is you can't predict these things easily. People who are the best of breed at doing that will continue to do it, but the world changes. And that's why I'm urging in any of this modeling the notion of flexibility to say, well, all of a sudden, gee, it turns out this model was just wrong. Great. Plug it in, now see what the world looks like, and then we go on from there. So you're going to take a left turn, you're going to take a right turn. This notion that long-term planning is about an ongoing process, not about sticking to your guns. Mm-hmm. Very different. It's basically saying, okay, and that's what's important to me about geodesign. Another thing that's important about it, it gives you the ability to do that iterative, real-time, etc. The world changes. You can know that it changed minutes later and realized, this was a great plan for the last 30 years, and starting next year, we're going to do it this way because the world changed, we understand it, and we don't have to wait another 20 years to make the hard choices.
Just another real question and interest. You talked about the role of an individual, like in film or in architecture. We know these personalities. You talked about last night the role of geodesign as being collaborative.
Yeah.
And I think these are two things that I'm thinking. Okay, so then the platform, this knowledge base, is an instrument for both the creator, the inspirational designer, but it's also a platform for collaboration. Or do you guys have an argument about this?
Well, I think they're frankly compatible because, again, the visionary can't get their thing built without a collaboration of people who are going to execute it. And at the same time, the people are collaborating to execute until someone managed to get the money for it and put the thing together and get it to happen. So the fact that the processes can be quite different, they both need each other. And the idea of the role of the visionary has certainly been important and compelling to this country and the experiment we call the United States of America and just doing a whole set of things that broke a set of status quos. But at the same time, as a country matures, as people mature, as ideas, there are different needs at different times for things. Just as I'm saying, this idea that everybody needs innovation, no, they don't. And in fact, it's often disruptive to have innovation.
My view is different. I think that the creativity comes from the team, not from the individual, at a certain level of complexity of problem. Because the individual is not likely to know what the constraints are, but the sum of the individuals on the team might, and then you find the solution. And it becomes more likely to be implementable. Now, it's not just that they need the team to implement. I think they need the team to be the creative force.
I agree, kind of. Because I think the great visionaries are the ones that can draw the energy, that can motivate the people to follow them, that take the best ideas from... Steve Jobs was not a great designer. He was not a great engineer. He was not anything. He's pointed to as the current, if you had to pick someone who built the value of Apple, etc. But he had a talent of compelling people.
I agree.
To want to go and give, etc. So I think we're not as far apart as one might think, but I think that simply having a bunch of people that collaborate well together is necessary but insufficient.